If human history has shown us anything about how we treat other cultures upon discovery and realizing that in some way they may be vulnerable to our own technology through sheer numbers or even amount of progression of the tech scale, then when it comes down to humanity running across another animal that may be sapient, things aren't looking great. For a very long time, Homo sapiens has looked up at the sky and wondered what could be out there. To some degree, it may be more so a common theme now than it once was, but the idea of other species operating and surviving out there while we are just kind of stuck on this rock has been something that has definitely come to light, especially as of since like the 1950s. Like a youngling grounded, all we can do is look out the window. But therein lies the question, while the other younglings run around out there, why are we stuck inside? Now, we really all know because breaking the gravitational bonds of our planet is quite difficult. But maybe the reality is we need to stay down here until we figure out how to be a little more civil, which could either make us better or it could result in us deep frying the planet like a bunch of hyper-intelligent, anxiety-ridden primates who are dumb. Rounding back to human history, typically when we come into contact with any other people of lower technological scales or less advanced societies, it's pretty standard that we just dominate them in some way or another. Resources is really what it all comes down to. So you have to ask yourself, a species that sees all that crap kind of going on down here, why would they ever want to come down and hang out? Would you want to go out and hang out with a species behaving that way? Probably not. Which rounds us around to why it's a really bad idea to crash into Earth, apparently. As an alien seemingly had nowhere else to go and chose the only inhabitable planet in the solar system, it would crash into Earth where its existence would be immediately covered up. As it would survive the crash, it would be captured and then disappear into the annals of history for only a very few select people to remember. However, its ultimate goal would be to escape. But what is this species and how does it operate, along with how is it like able to form this psychic bond with humans through touch? Let's discuss that in today's episode over Super 8. We kick off our story today with this being paramount, so massive copyright struggle inbound. No, it's for real, it's actually a problem. You already know how really this is gonna go down. Opening up on 784 days since our last accident, actually JK, it's 0 days since our last accident. Way to go, Paul. A youngling sits outside mega depressed as it appears as though his mother got by some piece of machinery, which we later find out was a steel beam weighing tens of tons. As everyone at the morning party kind of sits, the other younglings discuss what was in the coffin, which is, kind of actually a legitimate question. I mean, what did you put in there? I mean, obviously it's them, but you're talking about either way, it's gonna be pretty bad. So they discuss how Joe won't want to be in their movie anymore as an absolutely beautiful Buick Skylark pulls up. Man, this movie is it has so many classic vehicles. As a young man gets out and then heads inside, we can hear noises and yelling as the man is then thrown into handcuffs and pulled outside. Legally, you can now take his Skylark. The Buick Skylark, of course, having a V8 of either a 350 cubic inch or the big one, 400 cubic inch, which headcanon says that's what this one is. 340 horsepower at 5,000 RPM and 440 foot-pounds of torque with a bore of 4 inches and a stroke of 3.9 inches. Man, what a tank. If I wasn't so desperately in love with my 67 Impala, that would be a close third behind a 69 Mustang Fastback. Anyhow, it's now 4 months later. We are Alice Coopering out at school because it's officially over for summer. They are discussing Charles' new movie that they are filming tonight and driving out to the location. As they watch what Charles has so far, kind of recorded, they continue talking about the movie and Alice Daynard. Guessing Joe has got the hots for her. And holy lord, there is a lot of younglings at Charles's house. The family then tells Joe he can stay if he wants to eat, but he then is like, nah, I'm gonna head home. Absolute baller parents, though, telling him that he has a place there, even if he doesn't want to go home. More so when they've already got collectively 10 mouths to feed. Heading just across the street, he calls out to his old man and then walks in on him crying. Honestly, you probably could have walked in on something worse, so at least he was just crying. But yeah, man, losing your woman ain't easy. I have become intimately familiar with that experience, but it happens to the best of us, unfortunately, from time to time. So heading to the bar, remember, it's the 70s, so it's nothing but brown couches that smell like cigarettes, smoking indoors around offspring, and bringing said offspring to the bar later. I mean, what? You're gonna need a ride, right? Different era. So his old man then tells him that he's going to baseball camp, and I can't imagine a worse hell than that. Then again, I spent my childhood doing landscaping and laying sod every summer, so who knows? Maybe it's way more fun than that. Then again, it built character, and I didn't get chased down and eaten by an alien as a result. So his old man then tells him, you can't keep running around with monster makeup on every summer. It's like, why not? Isn't that what the pre-adult years are for? So later that night, Joe goes to sneak out with his friends for the evening so that they can keep making this movie. As they sit there, Alice then shows up with the Buick Skylark, and she's not happy to see Joe. He's a deputy's offspring, so she's a bit perturbed about that, thinking that he's gonna go tell on her, but eventually she relents and then lets them all in the car. Heading to the train tracks, it's a windy night, and then they get everything set up. So Joe puts on Alice's makeup as she tells him, oh, my dad works at the mill. I'm assuming that's where Joe's mother worked. What an odd thing to bring up. You don't feel guilty, do you? Running through the scene, Alice then starts crying on command, and you gotta, imagine your dog dying or something. Or maybe that one time you held a bidding on a 67 Mustang Fastback that was going for $5,000, and you thought, hey, they'll just repost it for cheaper when this doesn't go through. Still haunts me to this day. I did not get it. So as they run through their scene, a train shows up, so they scramble to get everything ready since the train is about to roll through and its production value. As it passes, Joe looks out past the train and then sees a truck just hauling tail as it runs headlong into the train, derailing it, leaving the camera behind as the whole thing starts crashing around them. Tragically, it looks like the Skylark has been hit as well, and I know, you're devastated. Also, dude, interesting way to run from the train, so don't run with it. How about you just run directly to your right, and then you'll go away from the train? They must have gone to the Prometheus school from running from things. But at its conclusion, one car begins moving as the door then flies off into the air. And now I break away for a moment to tell you, you are absolutely, without a doubt, going to get blue-balled most of this movie. You will see what I'm talking about here soon enough. So as Joe looks on, now would be a very good time to leave, but the camera keeps running until it runs out of film, and oh, thank God. Actually, you know what? The Skylark is in salvageable condition. What are the odds of that? So Joe approaches the wreckage and then finds his friends have survived, which is pretty good. Finding blood, but not Alice, they kind of just assume, but Alice actually appears from behind as they realize, oh, that's not blood at all. It's just, Joe's fake blood kit from his container. Looking around, they then find these Rubik Cube looking things. Joe then grabs one of them as he climbs onto the train to look out at the wreckage. Joe then tells the rest of the group that a truck on the train tracks caused this. Approaching the truck, the driver appears to be taken out by the crash, and the key word here is appears. The driver was Dr. Woodward, a school biologist, which means by default, he was an absolute Chad. Allison approaches as his arm falls. Usually you don't really survive running headfirst into a train. You don't tell the tale on that one. So a map falls out of his hand as it shows the train's schedule. Dr. Woodward comes back, asking the group who they are. Dr. Woodward then pulls out the force multiplier, telling them they will take them out if they speak anything of this. They then hear voices in the distance as Woodward tells them to go as they make a break for the Skylark. Grabbing everything they can, they then jump into the car and nope out of there with a very clear display of all 340 horsepower, mainly because the inline 6 only had 155 horsepower. You wouldn't be burning out quite that well with that engine. So the group then approaches and finds the film that they had left behind, which is not ideal, as then they drive back to town, pedal to the floor. They agree not to say anything about this as then they get back home. Alice then hands Joe the Rubik's Cube as Alice drives out of there. But that night, all the dogs start barking and something is growling in the distance. Joe's old man, Jack, then wakes up the next morning as the Rubik's Cube tries to solve itself. Heading over to Charles's house the next morning as his parents ask if, oh, did you see the train crash? What? Yes, we did. Watching with Charles, Dr. Woodward is being treated by the Air Force Base, and I use that phrase treated very loosely. Joe then says it looks like a disaster movie, and this gives Charles the idea to go back and film it. Ah yes, returning to the scene of the crime always works out. Biking into town, Charles then tries to get the camera fixed as Joe calls Alice. He invites her to do some new scenes that they were working on, but she declines. Joe then tries to make some moves and heads over despite being told, yeah, don't come over. Bold strategy, Cotton. Women typically don't like that. But luckily the old man shows up and he tells Joe, she's not going to your party, Rotad. This is a go dog's house. Anyways, then he tells them, don't come back. Alice then agrees to go to, do the movie stuff afterwards because, her dad said no, and that's actually how it works with teenagers. Back at the crash scene, they begin filming with the train in the background in a completely exposed area. The military usually approves of things like this and in no way, shape, or form would investigate what you're actually doing on that very exposed hillside, filming their activities. You would think this whole area would actually be secured, but as they look and talk about why this is happening, using the camera, it appears Joe actually zooms in and realizes the whole thing is an Air Force train, which is kind of hilarious actually. Why not use a plane, fly boys? Eating their lunch, they try to figure out why Woodward tried to take himself out. It is at this point the Air Force begins repacking all the Rubik's Cubes. Also, there's a Geiger counter going off absolutely insanely, so that's not good. And Joe for sure has damaged his DNA at this point. So Joe's dad is involved in an investigation with the military, as then he's told it's not possible for the deputy to see the manifest on what was on the train. So a train derails with toxic substances in Ohio. What is this, Groundhog Day? Down in Ohio. As the deputy then heads back to the station, he talks to the sheriff about how they took molds of the tire tracks. The deputy then tells the sheriff to go check it out, as he's then told, bro, you just need to go on a vacation or something. That night, as the sheriff then heads to a convenience store, it's about to be a very inconvenient store. He then goes to fill up his cruiser, and look at those gas prices, baby. Of course, the dollar wasn't completely a hellscape back then, supposedly, so adjusted for inflation, it's about the same. But as he does, the sheriff then begins hearing animals shriek in the distance as a pack of wild dogs run by. Standard Ohio things. As he stands there, the gas pump then starts going wild as the cruiser starts running its own lights. Standard Ohio equipment. Then something moves from behind him in the wood line as the Connex gets thrown as the cruiser gets attacked next. Standard Ohio thing. Hearing the commotion, the clerk then goes to check it out as the lights begin flickering. Heading outside, he looks at the cruiser that has been totally screwed, and calling out to the sheriff, all he finds is the gas running. He hears something and then turns around as clearly something is basically on his tail as the store is broken into and he is taken. Pretty bad way to go. So while we don't actually get to see this creature at this point, it highlights something interesting which may explain the connection later. This creature would appear to have a field of influence of sorts. The electrical interference of its simple existence can disrupt the flow of electricity in general and all electronic functioning around it. Because of this, we can assume something about its physiology. So first, we would have to assume at this point that this creature itself has the capability to generate electricity, and this in and of itself is not too difficult. Our bodies run off chemoelectric signals currently, but these are minuscule in comparison to what would be needed for this to actually work around this creature. Internally, much like how an electric eel has an organ to help it generate electricity, so too would this animal. Presumably, nerve fibers would join each electrocyte on each side of its body, but not to the other. When the signal then runs specifically within an eel to, say, defend itself, this causes positively charged sodium ions to flood into the cell. The flow of these ions give rise to a temporary potential gradient across the cell and then a discharge of electricity. The body itself is not electrocuted because it's insulated with fat, which protects it. Clearly, the electric eel has enough energy to shock another animal, sending it away due to the pain that it's now caused. This creature and how it interferes with human electronics would be probably likely having a very similar makeup. It has the ability to shock, which I believe we will see later when it interacts with humans. This same ability, however, can be turned down in order to communicate passively as well, which given its evolutionary pathway would make sense, which we will discuss in a moment. So heading back to Charles in charge, they ask if they can blow up Joe's train model. As then the lights start flickering, which means that thing is close by. Alice then asks about how she's supposed to be a zombie, which again, she knows how, so why even ask? Joe then kind of half thinks about it for a second, but chickens out. And meanwhile, over the gulping gas, the deputy looks through the wreckage, finding the sheriff's force multiplier. That is pretty concerning. The radio then goes off telling Jack that they're getting a lot of unusual calls right now, but back in town, all the motors have been pulled out of the vehicles. Not the Bonneville. Also, that's a nice Mustang. 66, I'm pretty sure, and that is a Camaro in the background. But as the deputy then looks out at the military rolling by in very inconspicuous vehicles, that doesn't make him think anything's wrong. Now, the question you may be asking yourself, why the engines? Well, I'm going to spoil it for you. Engines back in the day were pretty much exclusively made out of cast iron. Now, a lot of engines either are made out of aluminum or at least have some aluminum in them, and this will be important. So later on, Joe then goes to search for Lucy, which is his quadruped. As he puts up flyers, he realizes pretty much all the dogs in town have gone missing. Bit strange, isn't it? When Joe then gets home, the cops are all talking about, donuts and speed traps as Joe then drops a flashlight coming in. As they sit there, the lights begin to flicker as once more everybody's like, oh, the power's going out. Not really. So the entire county appears to start going dark. Joe calls over to Charlie, saying the chair force are now taking molds of the tire tracks, but he agrees to help Charles tomorrow. Meanwhile, linemen are now showing up at the power lines, and they realize all the lines are actually just completely gone. They've been taken down. As one lineman looks out, though, he hears distant clanging noises. And I'm gonna go ahead and give you some advice. Anytime you ever hear distant clanging noises, you probably need to just leave. Continuing to work, eventually he sees a ton of junk flying through the air before a dumpster lands near his truck. Heading further up, the cherry picker then starts buzzing as he keeps searching. The lights begin to flicker as the creature comes through the trees and grabs him. The creature at this point clearly is looking for lines in order to run current, but nobody can know the inner machinations of his mind because they are an enigma. Anyhow, over at the town hall, people are pretty upset. Everyone thinks it's the Soviets at this point, which is a pretty logical conclusion, and one guy then talks about how he can hear distorted military chatter on certain frequencies. The deputy then asks him in private what those frequencies are as he gets the channels. Going into the station, Jack then tells them all to scan specific frequencies as Alice's dad complains about how Joe was at his house earlier that day. Guy kind of looks like a blonde Morbius. So as he morbs off screen, Joe and Alice then are up in Joe's room looking at all the models, including the C he got in his test. Remember, C's get degrees. Alice then asks Joe about the necklace, which he was holding in the train crash. Yeah, that's my mom's necklace. Thanks for bringing that up. Really appreciate that. So all the calls are now coming into the station about how all their dogs are missing, and they were scattered actually, well, they've been found anyways, in every direction. Man's best friend, huh? That's why I have a cat named Dr. Mamba. I expect he would absolutely leave me behind for food across the street, let alone, I mean, he's not even gonna be anywhere to be found if a giant alien shows up. So as the military starts rolling through neighborhoods, inconspicuously of course, they keep filming while also the military is in the background because, Charles doesn't really know how to stay away from these events. As the younglings keep rolling though, Jack then shows up as he's not happy of them filming this stuff, which they were already spotted by the colonel, so they're screwed. Jack then spills the spaghetti out of his pocket, saying, "I know what Operation Walking Distance is. I heard the chatter on the radio. You just put a big target on your back, brother." And then he threatens to call DC about this. Oh yeah, I'm sure the politicians will help. They're always useful. Also, this video is about to sound completely different because my recording mic, I actually switched it into the correct function mode now. Sweet. Anyways, so Jack comes in laying down some dad law on Joe, basically telling him he can't hang out with Alice. And this reminds me of actually one time when I told my dad when I was 13 that I was gonna ask out this girl, and he just straight up said, "No, you're not." Like, I didn't even know he knew her. I was sort of dumbfounded when I couldn't just straight up talk to a girl that I wanted to talk to, but I was like, oh, okay. It just never occurred to me that my parents could veto something like that. Anyway, she got pregnant the following year and dropped out of high school, so thanks, Dad. But Joe comes out and then says they aren't really clear on what's happening, so I'm upset because I'm Joe and I'm a teenager. And he basically says, I'm gonna hang out with Alice anyways. So after that bonding moment, Joe then just goes to take his bike out, and I mean, what is the old man gonna do? Pay attention to him? Fat chance. Heading into the cemetery, I'm assuming he goes to see his mom's grave. Also, that is a really big cemetery for a town of just 12,000. So as he checks out his necklace, he begins hearing clanking noises once again off in the distance. Pulling up his flashlight, something appears in one of the garages. So while that's going on, Jack then heads over to Lillian Air Force Base, where the military is just sort of, hanging out. Of course, it was an ambush because he knows too much because he put that target on his back, and now he's under military arrest, even though, I'm supposed to see the colonel, but the colonel lied, bro. Because the colonel is currently busy interrogating Dr. Woodward. They don't really appear to be helping him in any capacity, so the colonel then talks about, oh, he's mine, and Dr. Woodward says, well, I'm in him and him in me. Very cryptic, of course, and that's the point. So they inject him with something to basically flatline him, as the doctor then, kind of checks out, and the colonel kind of sucks. So later that night, with Joe sleeping in his room, he starts hearing tapping noises and sees Alice outside his window, which would make me scream like, I don't know, a little girl probably. Joe invites her in as she almost steps on the Rubik's Cube. I know it's Rubik Cube, but I like saying Rubik's. Alice then tells Joe why he shouldn't let Charles blow up his train. So as they talk, the power then comes back on somehow as the footage plays of Joe's mom and Joe as a baby. Weren't all the lines really completely ripped out of everything? I feel like this would be a pretty difficult situation to fix that quickly. But anyhow, as the movie plays, it's, really happy memories where the mother always is gonna meet some grisly end because it's in every single movie, where the wife meets her end. It's I don't know, ethereal and floating curtains or whatever. And it's oh, look at me, we'll be together forever. It's a South Park episode. Anyways, Mr. Adler loses his wife in a pilot accident. And it's that. Okay. Not sure if you know what I'm talking about. Doesn't really matter. So Alice starts then crying, talking about how her dad drank that morning and missed his shift. Joe's mom ended up taking that shift, and then she got crushed by a steel beam. Ouchies. So it's her dad who should have gotten got, not Joe's mom. And allegedly, Joe wishes it was him instead of, his mom. And allegedly, so does Alice. Woof. With that done, the Rubik's Cube then begins trying to solve itself. Thank God, because I wouldn't be solving those things, as Joe uses his God-given right as a human and pokes that thing with a small stick, as then it flies through the wall and out of his house. Basically a direct line to the water tower. Heading over to Alice's house, her old man is up and does the cliche, I'm drinking and sitting and smoking on a couch bit. The ever classic in the 70s, I'll tell you. So he asks her where she's been. I mean, come on, Dad. You can't yell at your daughter like that. Leave some mental scarring, you dummy. But he realizes that a little too late, as then she nopes out of there. But then he jumps in his Skylark and goes after her like a total weirdo. Bro, settle. So he tries to say sorry, as then he totally wrecks. And those Buick Skylarks are not exactly very forgiving in wrecks. But he survives, and something's moving behind Alice. As she looks up, good God, how tall is that thing? Spoiler alert, it's about 12 feet tall. Her dad then gets out of the car, but she's totally gone. Nice job, old man. So with that tomfoolery happening, the military is doing a scorch and burn policy of the area. Martin and Charles have an argument over the train, as then he picks up the film. Meanwhile, a giant plume of smoke sort of just hangs out over the town with the Rubik's Cube actually still stuck in the water tower. As they continue their lover's quarrel, Charlie is angry at Joe because he's into Alice. I mean, dog, he's a teenager, that happens. But it comes out that Charlie also likes Alice. But they're young, so I don't know, maybe there's some young person watching this. Many a woman has come between a male friendship. Rise above and don't let the ooga-dooga hormones of your brain take over. So as they watch the film of the crash, Charlie then lets it go as he says Alice likes Joe too, so he, whatever. He talks about, I just haven't leaned out yet, which I mean, bro, just go for like a run or go to the gym, but do something. But anyways, as they watch like this whole thing happening on the film, they see something crawl out of one of the train cars. Grabbing the film, a siren begins alarming as the evacuation of the town has begun. A fire has been moving in towards the town as the Air Force was playing with matches out in the field somewhere and everyone's trying to GTFO. As the town leaves, Connexes on trucks begin moving in. And I mean, at least the military at least tries to help them this time instead of just the standard cliche of nuking the place immediately. So at the evacuation center, I just realized Joe hasn't seen his dad in like 2 days, classic, as Charles then runs into his family as Joe goes off to find his dad. Instead, he finds a very sober Mr. Alice currently experiencing delirium tremens. He grabs Joe and tells him that they took Alice and they are feeding him pills. He describes it as big, hairy, and pink, and says that no one believes him as Joe says, well, I believe you, and then goes back to his group. They try to figure out a plan to go back and find her. So Charles then convinces his sister to go hit on the film guy, and then she asks him to, take them in his car. It's very strange. In prison, the deputy has to take a leak, so he's escorted to the bathroom, but then turns around and attacks the guard and begins his escape with his uniform. Taking a shot at a fuel truck, he then blows it and then steals a Jeep. I believe that is a CJ5. They are super easy to flip over, by the way. Also, there are so many classic cars in this movie. If I stopped to talk about them all, this would pretty much be a car channel at this point. Looking out the caravan, he then heads back to town as the group heads into town. They need to get to Dr. Woodward's research. As they take back roads to get into town, they then head back to the school early. They then ask the driver to wait there like a douche. Breaking into the school, they then head into the trailer in order to find his research. Opening the door, it's just a ton of films. Then breaking into the actual building next, they learn Dr. Woodward was dishonorably discharged for subversive conduct. As they watch the film, the 1963 incident comes up. Listening to the research, they then realized that they had come into contact with a subterranean animal. The ship itself was made out of Rubik's Cubes, and all the creature wanted to do was really just rebuild his ship and go home. The military held the creature as prisoner, and through pain and lack of compassion, they taught the alien to hate them all. Through touch, though, the creature was able to make a psychic connection as it grabbed Dr. Woodward. The alien then let him know that he's pretty upsetty spaghetti, which I'm pretty sure everybody could know that, and Dr. Woodward was attempting to help him, as then the military breaks into the school next, arresting everyone. So here, I believe I have put together an idea that helps to explain this, and it's based upon electromagnetism beyond just your standard electricity usage, which in turn would necessitate the appearance of a magnetic organ, as well as an electrical one. But how does this work, and what purpose would it even serve? This species, in my mind, in some capacity, could use electromagnetism as a form of communication. Being that it is a subterranean species, this would mean that any of its kind, also down there, may have had an easier time of communication by being able to accomplish something through open lines, like through their organs. But let's take it even further back into the proposed evolutionary pathway that also explains why they are as large as they are. Now, before getting there though, one of the big things is if you've ever been in a cave system and you've walked around a corner and you yell out for somebody, they might not be able to hear you because, believe it or not, sound does not really travel well in caves. I got lost one time with a dead flashlight. That was not a good time. But eventually I was found, obviously, because here I am making YouTube videos. So, first, the species appears to be bipedal in some regards, but may actually use its hands as a way to move under the ground, and clearly those are also for digging. Somewhere in its ancient past, these animals would have developed in a way to move in the ground, potentially using its own planet's magnetic field as a guide of sort so that it would know where it was going. This is not too strange considering animals like birds and whales use Earth's magnetic field to do exactly the same thing on migrations currently. By having this organ, it may work in tandem with another. The magnetism organ can be combined with the electrical organ to create essentially what is an EMP field around it. This appears to work continuously regardless of input, meaning it is an autonomic function, and of course autonomic function meaning basically it's controlled by your nervous system or its comparable nervous system to function without conscious input. So by this happening, this would mean that over time, as the species evolve, potentially in more frigid soils, causing them to increase in size because a larger animal has a slower metabolism but is able to retain heat better, the passing EMP fields would be picked up by one another, possibly in an adjacent cave, and it could be offering as like a form of communication. I say this is communication because Dr. Woodward's explanation saying it communicated with him through this means. The electromagnetic field can be used to convey thoughts and feelings to one another concerning its own species, and with humans, the feelings can be passed along as our brains have their own electromagnetic field to a degree, although likely our brains are not as adept at deciphering information, whereas the alien would know everything about an individual that it comes into contact with. This field in humans also is very small naturally, but in the alien it appears to spread in all directions quite far. Again, under the ground, this would be a fantastic way to remain in communication and not lose track of where you are. It also helps to critically explain what's going on with its ship, which we will see here soon, as well as there's more supporting evidence that this thing really is releasing an electrical field of sorts. So back to the movie. Oh, thank God the Colonel's here. The Colonel then looks at Joe, realizing that he's the deputy's offspring. Then another guy just takes Joe's necklace, like, okay, doucher. That seems relatively unnecessary. Meanwhile, High Times in the car realizes he's surrounded by the military. He calls out on the radio, but nobody answers. Jack at this point then goes to talk to Roscoe, and Roscoe tells Jack that good lord, that Joe is currently with his friends and they were grabbed by military personnel. Jack goes to ask one of his friends, as then he hands him the film, letting him know what is happening. So during the transport, things aren't looking so hot for the group. Luckily, there's a 12-foot tall, super pissed off alien that rams the bus, popping one of the tires as the bus then comes to a stop. The military then gets ready to fight as they load up tracking darts, which, why not just tranquilizer darts? That's all I'm saying. Opening the door, one of the soldiers is then ordered out. Good time with that one. So the soldier then immediately gets grabbed and thrown around like a baby in a dryer, as then he's dragged out to God knows what fate. So they start trying to get the bus going, as then it's pushed and toppled over completely. The creature begins growling and approaching the bus. The Colonel then can hear the thing growling outside the bus as they realize they need to use force multipliers and just take it out. The Colonel then runs to the back of the bus as he's trying to basically let out the group, but he doesn't have the key. The driver then gets crushed by an arm, and looking up, the Losers Club spots broken glass above them, and that's their way out. Climbing out, man, that thing is massive, but it's so focused on the Colonel that it doesn't really seem to care about them, which is probably a good thing. The Colonel then runs out of ammo as it looks at him before completely smearing him against the glass. So this thing will absolutely turn you into a fine meat paste if it doesn't like you. The alien then runs off with his own personal mission to complete. Jack at this point goes to grab Mr. Daynard, as then they both nope out of there. So now Joe gets his necklace back as the film guy then shows up listening to disco because he realizes Charles' sister likes disco. So Joe takes over driving duties as then they head back to town, but in doing so, what are these things, APCs I think? The military appears to be actively engaged with the creature and the group is stuck in the crossfire, except it's not what's happening because the concussive force detonators are all firing by themselves. It appears potentially the creature may be involved, but we can really see the field of influence concerning like how big it is here. This is several blocks of a neighborhood where all electrical components are firing by themselves. The issue is though, some of the people's force multipliers, which have no electrical components, are firing by themselves, which arguably doesn't make any sense. So running into a house, it's Kathy's house. You never met Kathy, so don't worry about it. It immediately gets hit with a round as Martin then gets his leg broken and has a bone sticking out of it. Ouchies. Running to the garage where the creature had been digging near the cemetery, they're able to break in and find a giant hole into nothingness. Luckily, the high concussive force detonator youngling brought sparklers, and it's quite dropped, like enough to definitely break at least a few bones. So good luck, guys. So as Jack and Mr. Daynard are driving along, Flash Gordon then apologizes to Jack, and he said he came over to apologize that day that the, funeral was, but Jack's like, don't worry about it, it was an accident. I mean, it really wasn't his fault, crap happens. And speaking of crap happening, Joe and 1970s David Spade continue their way through the tunnels, hearing machines powering down. Coming around a corner, they come across some pretty heavy computer equipment before Carrie finds the sheriff. Turns out the alien abducted the sheriff, but he did not abduct the deputy. Anyways, they're under the water tower, and there are people hanging upside down everywhere, which is like a little odd, like food, right? So as they look for Alice, yeah, this thing's eating something in the corner. That's not an ideal situation. So spotting Alice, they devise a plan to distract the creature. Joe makes a break for it as Carrie sets the trap. The creature continues to put together its ship as Carrie tries to get his lighter going, and then he finally succeeds as he lights it up and then bolts. Upon doing so, the fireworks go off and it goes to investigate, and Joe wakes up Alice by smacking her in the face. Eventually, a woman then just randomly talks to them as she is woken up as well. They begin waking up all the other people trapped as Carrie gets cornered by the creature and grabbed. So first, this alien is legitimately a carnivore, or at minimum an omnivore. It will absolutely eat meat, but it's not really too far-fetched to believe that, as it has to survive somehow, and the amount of brain matter that it would really need to support the level of intelligence that it has is going to be a protein-based diet. Interestingly though, this means that the amino acids that it needs to survive are all contained within humans, which is a bit odd. Even if like cats eat dog food, they can still get sick because it lacks the nutrition that they need despite cats and dogs both being carnivores. Anyhow, this electrical field produced does appear to actually have some offensive capabilities, and I do not believe the alien is just going to be going around smacking people in the head, knocking them unconscious. So there must be a few modes, if you will. The first mode that it may use is communication. This mode is on lower power of the electromagnetic field, which focuses on creating a field of influence rather than an electric shock. This allows for them to communicate underground with one another or with other species, should their brains be large enough and capable of understanding. The second is more of an offensive hunting ability. Upon coming into contact with another creature it intends at least on eating, it can then shock them, rendering them unconscious. This is why everyone looks relatively unharmed despite being unconscious. There are like no head wounds to speak of. But the third usage we will see in a moment. But before getting there, since we have finally actually seen the creature, let's talk about its physical anatomy for a moment. Starting with the feet, we see they're really kind of more like protrusions that they kind of stand on than actual feet. These toes spread out at 2 points and connect further up the leg. As we move up the leg, this alien is triple jointed with what appears to be chitinous armoring all the way up, hinting that it is somewhat of an insectoid. Interestingly, it is still sapient and clearly intelligent, indicating that internally it must have a closed circulatory system of sorts to properly perfuse all of its organs, like its brain, with oxygen. As the legs connect at what could be comparable to our own pelvis, it will choose mostly to run on 2 hind legs. This is somewhat of an interesting adaptation given that it lives underground. You would think it would be quadrupedal as not to, run its head into everything. As we move up to the abdominal area, or like at least abdomen comparable region, we see several lines run through it, but strangely there are literal holes in its thoracic region. Very much so unlike our own biology where our organs sit in our torso, the lines that run on its body leave space through basically the main portion of its chest. For what purpose this serves is unknown. Perhaps it makes it lighter and more agile, and that might be its only purpose. As we move to the arms, it has a actual pair of arms around the comparable region to our shoulders as humans, with a second set of arms connected just above those in the trapezius region. These arms will actually work in unison and appear as though if they are a single pair normally of arms because they lay on top of one another, creating a double set of arms. Likely one is used for digging while the other is more used for grabbing, but they can probably both be used for either. Moving up to the head, it is quite massive. A set of forward-facing eyes exists with a nasal cavity at the central area of the skull, and the mouth is massive, but not unlike our own, and it's filled with teeth, as again, it will eat meat. A crest sits on either side of the head, but it's presumed the internal skull space for the brain is quite large. So as the hostages make their way out, the sheriff then gets grabbed for a second time as everyone else starts getting picked off. Now, it's just the younglings making a break for it. As they get trapped in the corner, I assume, because surprisingly it's really dark underground, I suppose, it comes towards them. Joe then tells it to just go, it doesn't want to be here anyways. Squaring up on it, Joe gets grabbed pretty quickly, as then he's brought up to square up height. It clearly begins trying to communicate with him at this point. Talking to it, he basically endows it with the most ancient and philosophical of human nature. The understanding that it is what it is. And then looks at Joe for a moment before his machinery starts powering up. And then begins saying, screw it, and then runs back to its ship at this point. It is around this time that anything metal starts being heavily affected by the extreme magnetism. And unfortunately, all the muscle cars do as well, as the Rubik's Cubes then all fly to rebuild the ship. As they watch the model rebuild itself, Joe then spots the old man in the act of stolen valor. So here was the third level of strength concerning the field of influence. The ships that these creatures build are reliant on the creature itself holding it together, and without the creature, the Rubik's Cubes are virtually useless and inert. However, it also appears that some technology may exist that allows for this creature to rapidly redistribute metals, allowing for it to completely evaporate any metal near its ship and then use it to become a covering on the ship. This is also why it was running around stealing car engines and anything metal in an attempt to get enough metal together to allow for it to actually properly rebuild this thing. So his old man finally hugs him, probably something you should have done like 4 months ago, my man. Better late than never, as Alice's dad does the same. As Joe looks on, the creature then climbs up the water tower and into the ship and is finally happy to be leaving this backwater world where we don't even have 8,000 channels. Joe then lets go of the necklace for some reason. I didn't understand that one at all. Was that thing not important, or why wouldn't you want that? So as the metal on the water tower then is all turned into the ship, the water then falls back down. Also, quick question, wasn't the necklace made of silver? Silver is not noticeably magnetic, so I'm not really sure how that got pulled up. Maybe it was only silver plated, I don't know. Anyways, hopefully that alien doesn't come back and just annihilates our planet on principle, and that would probably not go too well. So Film Guy is too stoned to even see what the ship looks like as everyone just kind of watches on, and Joe and Alice then hold hands, having trauma bonded. 100% the healthiest relationship you will ever have for about 3 weeks. And thus concludes Super 8. So this species is known as and I'm going to try to say it correctly, Takaruzan. Not even remotely close, but they're a massive insectoid species that is mostly going to definitely be sapient and on par with humanity concerning our own intellect, and actually I would say they're probably even beyond our intellect, considering it's already mastered spaceflight. Nothing is known about their homeworld or their culture, but now that it's going back, I don't know, man, that thing might come and bring its culture over to us and just blow up Earth. Guess we'll have to find out in Super 8 2, Super 9. But anyhow, I want to thank you guys for watching. If you enjoyed, leaving a like would be greatly appreciated, and subscribing is a great way to stay up to date on when I post. I'll drop my Twitter, Discord, Patreon, and Roanoke Tales link in the description, where this week we were talking about a bridge that allegedly had like 600 dogs leap from it for like no reason. It's very strange. But anyhow, speaking of patrons, I'd like to thank mine real quick. Huge thank you to our astronaut, Rom Burgundy. Thank you, my man. Next up, I'd like to thank our astrophysicist, Desk Dancer. Thank you, bro. And next, I'd like to thank our scientist, Chad the Enjoyer of Explanations of B-Grade Horror Movies, Dakota23, Jax, Josh Blanchard, Lucian Dragon, Metric System, and Trash Panda in a Trench Coat. Thank you very much, guys. And the rest of my patrons, I do appreciate your support as well. It goes a long way towards helping this channel out, and again, it's appreciated. So that's gonna do it for me. I hope everyone enjoyed, and I'll see y'all in the next one.